Nazi Germany's invasion into Soviet Russia was the largest conflict in human history, resulting in the deaths of tens of millions of people. In this series, we're going to be examining the air war between the German Luftwaffe and the Soviet Red Air Force. Using primary and scholarly sources, we will be breaking down and reconstructing this conflict from the individual pilots to the operational level. Welcome to Air War in the East. Western Europe has fallen due to a mixture of Allied incompetence and the effectiveness of the German Blitzkrieg. The British Empire is all that remains, and the success of the Blitzkrieg owes much to the German Air Force. This effectiveness would go on to produce some of the most skilled airmen in aviation history. One of the top aces Germany had at the time was Wolfgang Schellmann, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, earning his first 12 victories there. He would go on to see action in Poland and France, eventually fighting in the Battle of Britain, where he would prove to be part of a new generation of younger, more aggressive wing commanders that the Luftwaffe was trying to push in order to achieve victory. But in the end, it wasn't enough. And when the Battle of Britain turned from stalemate to defeat for the Germans, Schellmann and many of the other top units in the Luftwaffe were transferred to face Germany's ideological enemy in the East, Soviet Russia. The Soviet military in Western sources, particularly their defeats, is almost without exception attributed to incompetence, fear of the NKVD, or even falls into wartime Nazi propaganda of plain inferiority to the German forces. But throughout the early days of the Soviet Union, they were quickly establishing themselves as one of the premier air forces on Earth. The Soviets were even responsible for training the German pilots in the 1920s, bypassing the Treaty of Versailles, which forbid Germany from having an air force. The secret training on Soviet territory at Lipetsk provided a core unit of airmen from which the Luftwaffe was able to grow from. As it turns out, one of the original trainees in this unit was Wolfgang Schellmann. But by the end of Stalin's purges in the 1930s, the Red Air Force had suffered immensely. Many of its most innovative designers, pilots, officers, and instructors had been dismissed, killed, or sent to the gulags. A dual command system had also been implemented, giving rise to the well-known and infamous commissars permeating the ranks. This stifling of the Air Force lasted from 1937 to 1939, after which Stalin realized his mistakes. Stalin abolished the dual command system and demanded an immediate remodernization of the Air Force. And by the time the Germans began their attack, efforts to bring the Soviet Air Force back up to snuff were still ongoing. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Germans had been extensively prepping. Scouting missions into Soviet territory for reconnaissance were becoming increasingly common. These scouting missions were spotted by the Soviets, but very little was done to deter them. Ironically, they were afraid that by shooting down these German planes, they would provoke them into invasion. The night before the invasion, a young German named Alfred Liskov deserted and snuck away from the massing Axis forces. Slipping into the Soviet Union, he warned them of the imminent invasion due to begin in just a few hours. The warning went ignored. Presumed to be agitating misinformation to provoke the Soviets, Liskov was arrested, eventually sent to Siberia, and never seen again. In the early morning hours of June 22nd, about 150 Luftwaffe bombers launched from air bases stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They were the tip of the spear into Soviet territory. Their mission was a pathfinding force to mark every airfield they could find in the Soviet borderlands. The German plan relied on identifying every Soviet airfield they possibly could and neutralizing the Soviet Air Force before it could ever get off the ground. The pilots on this mission were veterans, forged in France and over the skies of Britain. They were experts in night flight. When the pathfinding force reached their target airfields, they began to mark them with incendiary bombs, providing a beacon for the bombers coming up behind them. When the Pathfinders had completed their mission, 31 Soviet airfields were marked in the borderlands. The invasion had begun. A combined Axis force of over 3.5 million began to pour into the Soviet frontier. The Germans had sent forth 870 bombers to cover this advance, dwarfing the size of other aerial surprise attacks such as Pearl Harbor. But much like Pearl Harbor, the Soviets were in a similar position as the Americans were, in that their planes were bunched up wingtip to wingtip. The results were absolutely catastrophic. What resistance did make it off the ground was ripped to shreds by the agile German Bf-109s. Despite the surprise of the invasion, the Soviets managed to put up far tougher resistance than what the Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to. This was supposed to be another blitzkrieg, and instead the Luftwaffe was handed its worst losses in a single day to this point, with 78 aircraft completely destroyed. But as the day ground on, the outcome was beginning to look grim for the Russians. And when the situation had grown desperate beyond measure, there was one tactic left. If you used it, the chances of survival were slim. They even had a word for it. It means battering ram. That was not the first or the last time the tactic was used that day. Major Shellman is leading his squadron back to base after a first successful mission of the invasion. One of Shellman's wingmen spot Soviet fighters in the distance, and the ace can't resist. He swoops in through the clouds, and the 30-year-old effortlessly claims the 26th kill of his career. There is one pilot among the Russians who decides to stand and fight, Lieutenant Peter Kuzmin. He turns his plane towards Shellman and begins to fire away at him until he runs out of ammunition. With no ammo and flying a plane nowhere near fast enough to escape, he attempts a mid-air collision with the German ace. A mid-air collision is surprisingly difficult, and they pass by each other several times. Shellman is an experienced pilot and certainly no fool. He immediately realizes what Kuzmin is trying to attempt, but for reasons that will never truly be known, Shellman doesn't use his superior speed to just break away. Shellman decides to continue the fight, clearly confident in a 27th victory. Little did Shellman know he would be getting that 27th victory. It would be the last thing he sees. Even for those unfamiliar with history, there are several key historical events that we can use to compare to this horrendous day, to get a true sense of what was lost. For example, the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor saw the destruction of 300 planes in one terrible morning for the US.
A date which will live in infamy.
The Battle of Britain, far and away the most famous aerial fight in the Western world.
We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Saw 1,744 Allied aircraft lost over the period of nearly 4 months. June 22nd, the opening 24 hours of the largest invasion in the history of man, saw the Soviets lose 1,489 aircraft on the ground, another 322 in the air. These numbers were so staggering that the German high command didn't believe them, and Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, had these numbers double-checked. For the next several days, the advancing Germans carefully tallied every burned-out wreck they could find. The final number was even larger. Close to 2,000 Soviet planes lost. But they were not deterred.
История показывает, что на победимых армий If evil.
Next time on Air War in the East, we're going to be looking at the advance towards Moscow, how the increasing losses are becoming unsustainable for the Germans, and how the Soviets get their act together and begin to launch a counteroffensive the likes of which the world had never seen. If you liked what you watched here today, do remember to like and subscribe. It makes a huge difference. Thank you, and I will see you next time.